Reshaping the landscape of health, germ theory versus the terrain model. So the first slide I'm going to open up with here is there's a lot of information. We're going to go over this, but this is just really quickly some differences between the two. So the germ theory, what has dominated the medical landscape for since the 1880s, basically. The germ theory says that these invisible microorganisms that exist in water, in the atmosphere, and air, and all over the place, that these microorganisms get transmitted between individuals, and those are the causal reasons for disease. Um, and so, in a nutshell, it's this exterior bad guy coming in and attacking our bodies, and our bodies have to fend off these invaders. Whereas the terrain model focuses more on the internal environment. It's really, it's really more that these infectious agents are opportunistic rather than being the actual cause of the disease or the symptoms. They're really more of a byproduct, but we'll get into that later. So I believe that the germ theory by itself is incomplete. It simply does not account for all of the problems that we see in our world today. And as we exit out of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think this is a great topic to talk about because there are some questions left on the table here that I think the terrain model will answer. But first of all, what are the limitations of germ theory and why are we even investigating this? Germ theory, although admittedly it has advanced medicine quite a bit and has helped us to become healthier and live longer, that's undoubted. However, I do believe that germ theory oversimplifies how nature works. So it neglects the host's environment. So anything that you have going on internally with you specific, your genetic makeup, any physiological problems that you might have, these are not taken into account. Every person is quite different, um, but we are treated the same in the germ theory model. So another problem with this is all we do is medicate with the germ theory. So something hurts us, we are given a pill or a liquid or some sort of powder to stop that thing from hurting us further. But really, what we've ran into and what many physicians are worried about is a antimicrobial resistance or superbugs, as you might see in the news. So this is possibly a global problem. And as you can see here on the graphic, it's just a really simplified version of how a bacteria would become resistant to an antibiotic. Moving forward, and we'll get to it later, um, by 2050, they have estimates that AMR deaths or antimicrobial resistance deaths globally are going to surpass uh, cancer deaths by 2050 globally. So it's a real problem. But we just continue medicating and exacerbating that issue. Um, and I so the next slide here, we're going to look at why we need to rethink our approach. So this is host susceptibility for infection. As you can see, patients with underlying conditions obviously had a harder time during COVID with um, being infected, and also the mortality rates were higher for people who had comorbidities. So this is another data point that you look at people who are healthy before they're introduced to a pathogen have a much easier time dealing with that pathogen and fending off those symptoms and that sickness than someone who has underlying conditions and chronic illnesses, which we do not take into account in the germ theory. The terrain model does. So we 6 in 10 Americans suffer from a chronic disease. whether that's celiac disease or diabetes, any number of these things are comorbidities that will make your body more susceptible to a pathogen. Is really the what the graphic is showing here and the point I'm trying to get across. And this is that slide that I was mentioning. As you can see on 2019, AMR or the antimicrobial resistance deaths were about 700,000 globally. By 2050, it's projected to surpass cancer and be 10 million a year. So, a real problem that we need to probably take a look at before 2050. So, the terrain model solution. The terrain model shifts our focus from external pathogens to our internal environment. What we can see here, the terrain model is really concerned about with the body's microbiome. And when people hear about microbiome, they think about the stomach or the gut, which is true, which is correct. However, our microbiome is all over our body, and our entire body plays different roles in it. As if we continue on this path of germ theory, as we continue to ingest these antibiotics, these damage our microbiome, and our microbiome will affect our mood, our intelligence, our cognition, um, and many, many other things. So not only are we spending money on prescriptions that we don't need, but they're actually damaging us and exacerbating the original bug, if you will, and making it into a super bug potentially in the future. As I said, the terrain model categorizes pathogens as opportunistic rather than being the causal agents of a disease. And I think it's important to note that this microbiome here, there's a lot of information going on, but to highlight how important your microbiome is, it performs about 70 to 80% of all of your immune system functions. So when we're damaging that in the middle of a pandemic, as things are evolving and becoming more virulent to vaccines and other medications, we're hurting ourselves in our ability to fend off these invaders. So, um, moving on, again, this is another data point for the terrain model. I have a source that in 2020, 94% of all hospitalizations for COVID in 2020 in New York City had comorbidities or had other chronic illnesses prior to getting COVID-19. What you'll find in that source is that it says talks about how people who are physically active, people who are mindful of what they eat and are their activity levels are higher than normal, they have a much easier job fending off the disease or not even getting infected in the first place. Again, referencing that our internal structure, our internal system is operating on all cylinders, and so it's ready and firing on all every gear to get rid of any sort of problems that start occurring in our bodies. And this is actually an infographic from the state of California. And as you can see here, exercise was the greatest percentile for, they say, reducing the risk of serious complications or the severity of your sickness, you could say. Another danger with germ theory that the terrain model addresses is the dangers of over sterilization. And I'm sure you can remember at the time wiping everything down during COVID with the masking and the vaccinations, and yet still people were getting sick. How is this possible when we are hyper vigilant and doing all of the health protocols that our officials say that we should do, and we're still getting sick? This doesn't make sense. We need something that will complement germ theory because we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. However, over sterilization, and you can think of this as sterilizing your your environment around you, like your house, or over sterilizing your physical vessel with medications, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, etc. So over sterilization the goal is not to become the cleanest possible and avoid all sorts of germs. The goal is to be able to encounter every type of germ and have our internal structure such that is able to fend off these things that would hurt our body. As we move forward, let's just take a moment and visualize two different scenarios. There's a fork in the road here. Either we continue on with germ theory, or we make a pivot and we go with the terrain model, or there are other models and paradigms that are put forth, but I believe the terrain model is the most convincing. But as we pivot, if we continue with the germ theory, we're looking at antimicrobial superbugs in the that are going to be causing massive deaths in the future. We're looking at huge spending on our healthcare system because we cannot keep our populations healthy. It's a constant state of maintenance. And lastly, the over sterilization that we just looked at. We do not want to create a world that is um, Clorox down, completely void of any sort of dirt or uncleanliness. Nature is dirty. Nature has bad things in it. Our bodies are part of nature and are able to handle those things if we keep our internal structure in alignment with how it naturally is meant to be. And we do that with exercise, food, prayer, meditation, and being in nature. So as we pivot, so that's the direction we're heading in if we keep going down germ theory. If we make a pivot and we try something new with the terrain model, we're going to be seeing communities make a shift to a more nutrient dense based diet. We're going to be seeing communities looking at taking supplements and filling in gaps in their nutritional, what they're getting nutritionally from their food. We're going to be seeing preventable diseases that are preventable stay there, and we will see a drastic decrease in chronic illness in the American population. And lastly, the terrain model does not work without an active and balanced lifestyle. It's part of it. So we need to be promoting supplementation and eating the right foods, yes, but also exercise is very important. Sunlight is very important. Clean air is very important. We are part of nature, and the further we remove ourselves from that nature, the more our inner terrain is going to have problems. So as we wrap this all up, I appreciate you got your guys' attention. Let's go back to the founder of the germ theory, Louis Pasteur. And you might recognize the last name from the pasteurization process. This was also something he's well known for. But this is, I haven't been able to verify this, although it seems widely accepted that this is one of his statements later on in life. The creator or founder of germ theory says, Bernard was right. The germ is nothing. The terrain is everything. Bernard being Antoine Bernard or Béchamp, the founder of the terrain model, is who he's referencing there. But I find it interesting that even later on, as his work developed, he said, "No, I think something's missing here. We need to add something to this or reevaluate." And right before we wrap up, this infographic on the right hand side here, germ theory versus terrain theory. This is a perfect image for if you just really want to boil it down. What is germ theory? Well, this fish remains in that environment, and you just keep adding some clean water to the bag, maybe, or maybe vaccinate the fish against the dirty water. Whereas the terrain theory on the other side of the other bowl, you actually clean the tank out. And it seems like that would be something that would make sense to me and be most effective. So let's get off this hamster wheel. I think this is a call to action to my audience here to be terrain centric, try to develop some of these habits, educate yourself on what the terrain model has to offer and how you can maximize the benefits of the terrain model. And again, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. However, we do need to make a pivot. The germ theory has too many shortfalls and I believe needs supplementation with the terrain model. Thank you for your time